See, I think there is a really interesting relationship between thinking about Stoicism in modern times and vulnerability and suffering, because I think they're related to each other. I don't think you deny your vulnerability and you're stoical because you suppressed it. I think you accept your vulnerability, and that allows you to have it both in a private but also an intimate sense, if it makes sense, with a friend or a lover or a partner or whoever. So I don't think this should be posed as one or the other. I think they are very, very related. Now, maybe this is because I'm a therapist and can't contain their feelings and they can't contain their suffering, whether it's rage or sorrow or whatever it is. The point of therapy is, in some sense, for that feeling to be transformed and live inside of them as the hurt or whatever the fundamental feelings are, and for them to then contain it. So I think they're two sides of the same coin, really, rather than oppositional.
So I mean, Havi, let's turn to you on this. I mean, when you see it as being, unavoidable, it's not something we choose. We can all agree with that. But is that something that we kind of is just unfortunate and we have to deal with it, or do you think it's kind of good that there's some suffering in the world, And I suppose that's the thing I'm not quite clear about when people talk about suffering being beneficial, whether they think we have to make them, it's there, we have to deal with it, we have to make the most of it, we have to sort of grow through it. But would it actually be better if we just didn't have it at all? I mean, would your life have been better if you didn't have this real problem to overcome with your own health, for example?
I think the question can be, can we, if we were to think of adversity as a form of post-traumatic growth or edification, one obvious question is, well, aren't there easier ways to be edified or to grow without having to have the trauma first? It's an interesting one. And I think I would say that in terms of life as we know it, a life without adversity would be so far removed from anything recognizable to us that it would just operate under such radically different conditions that it's just quite hard to imagine what it might be like, to the point where you might think, is it even useful beyond being a sort of fantasy, I suppose, to think about that. And I think, I'll call in Freud, if I may, on 2 points. The first is, he famously said, I'm not a pessimist, I'm just a realistic person. I kind of see what reality is like, what people are doing to each other, writing back in the early 1930s, for example. And I can just offer this idea that we have to help each other through these kinds of situations, but we mustn't delude ourselves into thinking reality is any prettier than it is. Okay, so that's one thing. The second thing, which I think is profoundly important, that he said, well, you can't get the good things if you're not risking the bad things. So if you want to love someone, that love entails with it the possibility of loss. If you're invested in an ideal or a goal, the risk of it not coming good or falling apart or disappointing you is always there. So it's really just the kind of the most fundamental emotional calculus. If you want to love, if you want to get attached, if you want to gain, you have to make yourself vulnerable in that way. And you're obviously making yourself vulnerable to the possibility of suffering and disappointment and pain. And so in a way, it's a package. And I don't think it's really very, I don't know how productive it is to ask ourselves, what would a human life look like without that whole aspect? Because it's not clear to me that it would resemble in any way how we live and who we are now.
Well, but that's interesting. I will turn to Anders in a minute, because I think there are kind of different kinds of suffering, right? And now there are certain kinds, I think you alluded to towards the second part of what you were talking about, like, relationships, projects, things where the possibility of failure is built in. And if you don't make yourself vulnerable to those failures, you also don't give yourself the opportunity of the benefits, and that's true. there are other things like, disease and illness where that's not the case. If we could if I could snap our fingers and get rid of, relationships and projects because they have the risk of suffering, no one would do that because we want the rewards. If I could snap my fingers and there's no more cancer, there's no more of your lung disease, most of us would say we would do that. So it seems like, although there some sufferings are tied in with good things and it's a package, in other ways it isn't. And I'm wondering whether, with that light, if we turn to someone like Anders who's a transhumanist, they're not perhaps maybe not quite the completely sunny utopians that we might think, that you want to get rid of some kinds of suffering, right? But you think you can't get rid of all suffering for the reasons that Havi have explained. Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so my friend David Pearce, he wrote a big manifesto in the late 90s, The Hedonistic Imperative, where he laid out his project about getting rid of suffering and only maximizing pleasure. And of course, the obvious argument is, wait a minute, how do you even function in such a world? And he is arguing that there are information-sensitive gradients of bliss that would be directing the post-humans in this world. Now, how that would actually work is an interesting technical, biological, philosophical problem, which I don't think anybody, at least not Dave, thinks has actually been solved. But I think there is something interesting that there are some forms of suffering that are instrumental. If I hurt myself, pain signals should not just tell me that I need to be careful about with the wounded part of my body, but also that I should definitely stop doing whatever is hurting it. And that links necessarily over to an emotional system. There is an emotional component to pain, which is where it ties up with actual suffering rather than just telling me that, oh, I stubbed my toe. Now, we might want to modulate that emotional part, especially when it's not relevant. But there is other forms of suffering, like social pain. If I'm feeling lonely, so a part of my brain gets activated that actually overlap with the emotional part of the pain system, even though there is actually not at all any physical component. Now, the really interesting thing is also, if I get disappointed, something was not as good as I had expected it to be, then I also get this kind of activation. So that is a kind of common pathway. Now, we want to be information sensitive. If bad things happen, I don't care. Then I'm kind of failing at life. I want to fine tune this so I don't get that unnecessary suffering. And the really tricky part of suffering is that it's something that becomes part of us. I am suffering. One of the best ways of avoiding pain and suffering is, of course, to say there is suffering and say that there is no self. It's not tied to me in particular. That's a quite useful trick sometimes when you're at the dentist or something. But quite a lot of important things need to be tied to our identity. We can, of course, argue that actually maybe having that cohesive self isn't that, haven't the Buddhists been telling us that we should give up on that? And maybe there actually be other ways of organizing how one functions that are utterly different. And again, very interesting options here. But I do think that, yeah, a suffering-free world would have to run on in such a different way that we would say those inhabitants are not quite human, but actually quite different. And we, on the other hand, get a world that has much less suffering. And I think, yeah, and we can still probably be recognizably human. Because what I think we want to do is deal with the meaningful forms of adversity, the stuff that actually matters. Quite a lot of the pains and aches we're getting are just because of biology telling us a signal over and over again, even when we already got the message. And we want to figure out ways of focusing on what matters for us to fix.
I'm happy to come back to you on that because I picked up on then we come to Susie.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.